Good evening. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see so many people at this event. We are here to explore and discover the idea that the loss of biodiversity is not necessarily a disaster, or maybe we will discover that it actually is a disaster. You never know. This event is made possible by X, our host, and by Studium Generale, the TU Delft platform that helps staff and students develop in a broader sense and stimulates debate, which I think is very important. My name is Bertus Beaumont. I'm a scientist, researcher, and teacher here at TU Delft in the Department of Bio-Nanoscience. And helping us to explore this topic this evening is Dr. Bas Haring. Studium Generale also invited a journalist who has written on this topic, Tamar Stelling, but unfortunately she cancelled. So the program is slightly altered this evening. Bas Haring will basically share with us his ideas, and then we will explore them. But let me first introduce Bas. He has a PhD in computer science, which was a surprise to me. So you are also a nerd, just like all of us. Well, I'm actually not a nerd because I'm a biologist. And he's a philosopher and a professor of public understanding of science at the University of Leiden. He has written several successful popular books, sort of at the interface of science and philosophy, I would say. And recently he's been, or maybe also already for quite some time, he's been causing a stir, talking about the possibility that the loss of biodiversity is not the disaster that many of us feel and think it is. So he is, if I understand it correctly, working on an extensive essay that covers this topic, and tonight he will lecture to us on this topic. So we'll start with a lecture by Bas, and after that I will engage in a conversation with Bas, and I will also try to ask you for your input. So it's really an event that all of us can interact in. So so I think I've covered everything. Bas, I invite you to enlighten us with your vision.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
First, I think I'm going to rearrange some things. So I want to halfly sit down. Is that okay? Is it okay if you rearrange things?
Yes,
yeah?
yes.
Okay, that's just for my comfort. And I'm not used to presentations. I have this little device by which I can show slides, and maybe I'm pushing a button coincidentally, and then you see another slide. Possibly that happened a couple of seconds ago when you saw a black screen. Maybe I caused that. Okay, I like it like this, and I also have an espresso here. Okay, I take a sip of my espresso. Have a chat with your neighbor for 3 seconds or so. Okay, thanks for the introduction. Where are you? Okay, yeah. My name is Bas Haring, and I'm indeed a nerd. When I gave, more or less, when I gave my presentation slides to the audiovisual people, I said it's a file called foo, and I thought that everyone here in Delft would know the convention of foo. It's a computer science convention. If you don't know a name for something, you call it foo, F-O-O. And a second name for something you don't have a word for yet is bar. Foo and bar are two important words for computer scientists, but apparently not for the audiovisual people. They're not computer scientists. Who knows foo and bar? Oh, okay, quite some of you. Okay. Before I start with my sort of presentation, try to explain why I think biodiversity loss is not necessarily a disaster. I wish to explain why I do this, since that's a question I typically get. Why do you tell this story? We are changing our world in such a drastic way. We feel so bad about it. Why do you say that it's not a disaster? I have 3 reasons for that, and I will give you those reasons before I start with my discussion. One is, and I need my notebook to look where I am. One has to do with my past. My first book was also about biology. It was a children's book about evolution theory. And the reason to write that book was a sentence that quite some people use, and it's a sentence: animals reproduce for the species to survive. It's a very normal and common sentence. People use that sentence. Animals reproduce for the species to survive. But actually, it's not true. The sentence suggests that that animals have a goal in mind of survival of their species, and that's the reason for them to reproduce. That's not true. It's different. Only those species survive of which the animals, or plants also, but let's focus on animals, only the species survive of which the members reproduce. That's a way different sentence. It's a true sentence. Only those species survive of which the members reproduce. All the other species that had members that did not reproduce, they vanished. But the second sentence does not have the word for. That's quite a difference. The for implies a goal and implies that animals reproduce for some goal. And it's a very common misunderstanding of people to attach goals to phenomena that we observe. And the same happens to biodiversity very often. It's supposed in the minds of people that all those species that are around will there be for some reason, for the good of an ecosystem or for something else. And in many cases also this for is an illusion. So and for me that's an important thing to write about. It starts me moving, such misunderstandings. So that's motivation one. Yeah? It's a general misunderstanding. That's for me a reason to start writing. A second reason to deal with a topic like this is that I'm not afraid of technology. I like technology actually. I studied also here I did some courses here in Delft, and I'm not afraid of a changing world. And not all people see changes like that. So many people are afraid of changes, and I think, okay, it's fun, it's interesting. That's a perspective I have on a changing world, on the changing planet. So I don't have a negative feeling towards changes, also if these changes are large changes. And then I have a third reason, but I have to look in my notebook. Oh yeah, I have maybe a different style of doing philosophy compared to other philosophers who also deal with this topic. The last of the former national philosopher was René ten Bos. I'm not sure if you're familiar with René ten Bos. He wrote a book, Extinction, and he wrote in that book that the loss of biodiversity is a very bad thing. It's a disaster. And he based himself on science. But he just read the scientists. He just used their input as knowledge and assumed it was true, and then he went on with his philosophy. I work differently. I like to study the science myself. And that makes me a not so good philosopher, since I can only spend my time only once, and not so good biologist either, but I try to do a little bit of both if I have a topic like this. How bad actually is the loss of biodiversity? I try to study the biology itself. So that's a second motivation of my work, and that's what I like to do. Clear? Clear motivation of why I do this kind of stuff? Is it okay if I sit here, or maybe I'm quite a moving person normally, but I'm still sipping my coffee, so I just sit on this, how do you call this, chair, bench kind of thing. Okay, so now this whole idea that biodiversity loss is a disaster is not a strange idea. Last year, I think it's a year ago, The Guardian had a huge headline saying, the loss of biodiversity is just as bad as climate change. Now, climate change is really a disaster, I think. I do believe in disasters. And if I think of a future world with a very different climate and a very different sea level, I think, well, that will be a quite disastrous consequence. And the same is thought of biodiversity loss. So the whole idea that biodiversity loss is a disaster is not something strange. Quite some people believe that it is a disaster. Now, what happens to biodiversity? That's my first image. I do have some pictures just that you have something to look at it instead of that thing. This is a kind of picture explaining what happens to biodiversity on our planet. We change the surface of our planet, primarily being there and via agriculture. I mean, this is agricultural land changes the surface of our planet drastically, and you see here only a few plants live there and possibly some minor creatures, and that's it. So presumably a forest used to be here or something else, and now we have only crop plants and some other creatures. This is a diminishing of this particular part of our surface. Clear? And this is what happens. So way less species, and all kinds of species are also getting extinct because of us. The rhino, panda, you know, those animals that we know them, but also all kinds of plants and all kinds of different creatures, they go extinct and they vanish from our planet because of our appearance and primarily because of agriculture. That's what's happening. And now the question is this a disaster? Yes or no? Now, disaster is a value question. It's not a scientific thing. 1 + 1 is 2. It's a scientific truth, more or less, or it's a mathematical truth, but science is about truths. Disaster, the concept of a disaster is about values. So how do we feel about this? What is a disaster? Now, disaster is a subjective concept. You have your own ideas of what a disaster is, but I try to stretch the concepts quite large so that most definitions of what a disaster is fits in, I think. And I have 2 sketches of possible disasters. And the first sketch is this. This is a well-known picture of a polar bear who is clearly suffering because of the loss of food. You know, he's starving. Actually, who knows this picture? It's a famous picture of a year ago, something like that. It's presumably a staged picture, and you see all these, you see polar bears like this, you see them for centuries already, but this is a starving polar bear, and I call that a disaster. If organisms suffer, and they suffer severely, then that's disastrous. And I don't mind what kind of organisms they are. Is it animals or is it humans? Yeah, so suffering, severe suffering, is one kind of disaster. And what I do, if I discuss that particular kind of disaster, I will refer to that part. And if I start to discuss that, I move this box to that side. Yeah? That's when I discuss suffering. That's one particular kind of disaster. So the question now is, will biodiversity loss cause severe suffering? But there's a second concept of disaster, I think, and that is this. I think that if nature changes into a desert and collapses into nothingness, then most of us will also call that a disaster, even if it is not, if there's no suffering going on. It's thinkable that a large part of the future planet will look like this, and there's still no suffering, it's thinkable, then I still call that a disaster. Is it okay? Yeah, so I try to sketch what I mean with disaster. And I try to stretch it a little bit even. This is also a disaster. Now I click this, yeah. And this is a little boy he swims in algae. So it's a blooming of algae. This is an extremely diminished ecosystem, having only one species of algae, or possibly some more species of algae, and that's about it. Yeah. So these are my definitions of disaster. It's either suffering, and I will use that box if I refer to suffering, and collapse of the entire nature or collapse of the diversity of nature, and I will use that box, and I put it here if I discuss that. Yeah? So these are my sketches of suffering. Note, by the way, that I skipped the definition of biodiversity. I did not define that. It's a more or less scientific concept. And for today, I assume it to be equal to the number of species living in some area. Yeah? That's what biodiversity more or less means. There are all kinds of different variations of that particular concept. How large is the area you consider? What do you exactly mean with species? How to deal with the abundance of species? How do you count species that are very rare? Do they have a high value in your biodiversity metric or a low value in your biodiversity metric? How do you take into account DNA differences between various species? These are details. For me, today, biodiversity is just the number of species living in some area, and that just goes down worldwide at least. Yeah? And the question here is this a disaster? And I first start with collapse. Now, collapse was this box. And just as a reminder, normally I would have a sheet showing I'm now discussing collapse. So collapse means this box. So I'm going to discuss collapse. And I put this in front. And when I change from collapse to suffering, I put there the other box, yeah? I just look at my time, it's all going fine. Now, first some water. Have a chat with your neighbor again. And the strange thing of the format tonight is that you don't have any room for interaction during my presentation, is it? Only afterwards. Yeah, that's the format of today. Normally I would invite you to interfere immediately, but okay, I just go on with my discussion, and then we have interaction. Collapse. Why would it be logical that if species are removed from a system, the whole system would collapse? I mean, there were two definitions of collapse. One is that it is gone completely, or it's getting extremely boring. Why? For many people, it's quite intuitive that something like that will happen because they unconsciously compare an ecosystem is just a patch of nature, they compare an ecosystem with an organism. They very often do so unconsciously. And if you remove parts of an organism, then indeed the organism collapses. Yeah? If you remove my heart, I immediately collapse. Or if you remove my kidneys, it will take a while, but I will collapse. Or if you remove the diversity of the parts I'm composed of, then at some moment I collapse. So it's quite intuitive that if an ecosystem is like an organism, and you remove parts of the ecosystem, I did not define ecosystem, but I suppose you have an idea what that might mean. If you remove parts from the ecosystem, then at some stage it collapses and it does not exist anymore. But this intuition is again an illusion. This is an incorrect. It's an incorrect comparison. And the main reason why this comparison is incorrect is that organisms are produced via evolution, or more precisely via natural selection, and ecosystems are not. Organisms reproduce themselves. Organisms are bounded entities. I am a bounded entity. You know, it's very clear where I am and where I am not. And the same holds for rabbits, and the same holds for trees. It's quite clear where they are. And these entities reproduce themselves. And there's competition between those entities. And these things, the fact that we have individual organisms that reproduce themselves, that get offspring that resembles their parents, and amongst which there's fierce competition, these truths, or these properties of these individuals, they guarantee that a process of evolution takes place, and that process gives those entities properties that are beneficial for themselves. That's what natural selection means. But this process does not work for ecosystems. Ecosystems do not reproduce themselves. That's not what they do. Ecosystems don't even have clear boundaries. There's no competition between ecosystems. Ecosystems are really very different things than organisms. And the intuition that remove a part from an organism and it will collapse cannot be transposed to ecosystems. Remove some parts of an ecosystem and maybe it will collapse, but it does not collapse because of the analogy with organisms. That analogy is a wrong analogy. Yeah? I hope that it's clear. You may ask me questions about it, but this analogy is wrong. In the heads of many lay people, I typically address lay people, that's my work, this analogy exists. They think, okay, an ecosystem is like an organism. We remove some parts from an organism, it collapses. The same holds for an ecosystem. Clearly, I'm afraid that species get lost because maybe in the end, then the whole ecosystem collapses. But that's an improper reasoning. So what is a better perspective on ecosystems And what you then can do is you can look at biologists and you can see what kind of analogies do they use themselves when they, for example, give lectures or when they teach about biology. And then they use the economy very often as a metaphor for what an ecosystem is. So not an organism, but an economy. I do have a picture of that. Oh, I think this was, yeah, this is comparable to an ecosystem. Now, this is a sort of a part of a forest. And in an economy, there are all kinds of different occupations. People do different things. And these different occupations are comparable to different species. So in an economy, you have individuals. In an ecosystem, you also have individuals. These individuals do different things, and their occupations are comparable to species. Yeah? And there's quite some overlap between economies and ecosystems. Biologists even use words that are used from economics, like words like producers. In ecosystems, you have producers, or there are all kinds of. I forgot quite some of those. Producers is the one competition is also a word used very often in economics. So there's quite some overlap between ecosystems and economies. There's a huge difference also, and one difference is that there's not really an analogy between eat and to be eaten. In biology, the one creature eats the other creature, but in economies, individuals don't eat each other. Companies do eat other companies, but individuals don't eat other individuals. But nevertheless, the analogy is quite instructive, and biologists use this analogy to understand what ecosystems are. And this analogy has consequences. For example, if you remove the diversity of an economy, it won't collapse. And there's no reason to assume that a less diverse economy collapses into nothingness or into a state of doing nothing. It is true that if you have an extremely boring economy in which people have only 3 occupations, let's say 3 occupations, then this is a quite vulnerable economy. Yeah, then it's not wise to have such economy, which you want your economy to sustain. So some diversity is useful to have an economy at all. That's very clear. But if you have some diversity, then more diversity won't give you much. A more diverse economy is not better sustainable than a little less diverse economy. Especially the rare occupations don't give so much. Like a basket weaver, for example. Yeah? Well, I think you have an idea. Or shepherd. I mean, it's a very rare occupation. And remove those occupations from an economy, and an economy will not collapse. There's, by the way, another important difference between economies and ecosystems that I did not discuss, and it is that in an economy, you have occupations that are there for the economy, that are there to organize the whole economy, like judge or police officer or tax, or working in the tax authorities. But such occupations do not exist in ecosystems. Ecosystems are actually comparable to extremely harsh libertarian economies without any global organization. Yeah? Remove some diversity of such an economy, and there are no reasons to assume that an economy in its total will collapse. Now, you should realize my rhetorical trick now. Yeah? I used a metaphor to explain what an ecosystem more or less is, and I drew conclusions from that. That's strictly forbidden. I shouldn't do that, since a metaphor is not something you can draw conclusions from. But that's the form of today. Yeah, I have 40 minutes, or something like that, to make my point. And I believe economies are a proper metaphor to understand ecosystems, a better metaphor than organisms. And it would need way more time to explain why I think that it's a better metaphor. But I hope you can follow me in my reasoning. I believe that economies are a good metaphor for ecosystems. And the conclusions from that are also in line with the conclusions from science. And these conclusions are more or less as follows, that if you have an ecosystem with some diversity, then it is more stable or less likely to collapse if there's more diversity. But this phenomenon stops. When you have more than a number of species in an ecosystem, then it's not helping you anymore. Yeah, that's in line. So the economy metaphor here is in line with known facts from ecology. Also, the very rare species don't have that much impact. You do have very special rare species in ecosystems that are maybe comparable to some occupations in economies, like the top predators. Remove them, and you have quite some severe impact in an ecosystem, but the ecosystem don't collapse then. They just change. They change in other ecosystems, but they don't collapse. The collapse of ecosystems is hardly ever connected to biodiversity as far as we know. There's also an intuitive, informal, and I now use another rhetoric trick. There's intuitive, informal knowledge that you actually just do know. If you try to collapse an ecosystem in your surroundings, and you do that just brutally, and you come back after a decade, you will see it grew back. Not in the state that it was originally, but it will not be vanished. Ecosystems or nature is quite a robust thing. It's like weed. It tends to come back all the time instead of a very unstable thing. Yeah? And the whole metaphor of an ecosystem is like an economy, helps you to understand that. And for me, it's a relieving metaphor. It makes me less afraid. If an economy would be like an organism, I would be afraid and think, hey, shit, we remove some vital parts of the organism and the whole ecosystem collapses, and that was a disaster. But if I see an ecosystem as an economy, I think, okay, things change, and well, maybe there's less diversity. Okay, well, we have another economy, we have another ecosystem. Fine, that's just change. It's not collapse, no disaster, according to my specification. Do collapses occur? Final review or reflection on the disastrousness of collapses. Do collapses occur? Yes, they do. The collapses do occur. Coral reefs can collapse. They can change into nothingness or in superborness in a very brief time, and that's a collapse. And there are other examples of vulnerable pieces of nature that can disappear, that can collapse. But these collapses are hardly connected to biodiversity loss. For example, coral reefs are just very sensitive to the temperature of the sea. Just if the temperature changes, you get a collapse. But it's a way different story than biodiversity causing a collapse. So yes, collapses do occur, but the connection of such collapses with biodiversity loss is actually not that large as far as I know, and only speculative once in a while. So now for the collapses. Yeah, I don't see any reasons to believe that loss of biodiversity is going to cause a collapse. I go to the suffering. And actually, I should say that there is a final topic that I also need to address, since I'm only now, when I'm discussing, this was collapse, yeah, one disaster. Just remove that. The other, I do it like this. The other disaster was suffering of humans and animals. I did not consider yet the idea that the loss of biodiversity is the disaster itself. That's a third option I will end with. Yeah, so maybe the diversity loss is the disaster. It's not causing a disaster. It's not causing suffering or collapse. No, it's the disaster itself. That's also a possibility, and that's my third reflection. Now, so this is suffering. Yeah? Does biodiversity loss cause suffering of either animals or humans? Not sure if I do have a picture making my point here. First, animals. I do have a picture. That's the briefest one. Now, this is a picture of a typical rainforest. And rainforests are these super diverse parts of the planet. Lots of species on small surfaces. I used to work there actually, so I know these areas quite reasonably, since my wife is a biologist and she works in a rainforest like this. What do you see? Anyone? Plants. Yeah, you see plants. Most of our nature is plants and hardly animals. Even in rainforest, you have hardly animals. A couple of birds per hectare. If you add the numbers, it's really only a few. You do have small animals. Vertebrates, no, it's the other one. Well, I'm geleedpotigen. What's the word for that? Well, leave it. Biological details that I forgot. Sorry. So you have all kinds of small creatures living, insects and that kind of stuff, but they typically don't suffer, or at least we assume, scientists assume, that these creatures don't suffer. So the loss of biodiversity, the chances are not that large that it goes along with lots of suffering. The intuition that nature is full of animals that are capable of suffering is not, that intuition is not really correct all the time. Moreover, the question should be, is biodiversity loss connected to more suffering than there already is in nature? And there is a lot of suffering. The Origin of Species of Charles Darwin has a chapter, I think it's chapter 3, and it's about the struggle for life. Life is, according to Darwin, a struggle with lots and lots of suffering. So, is biodiversity also going to cause more suffering? It's very unclear. There already is a lot of suffering. And if I would be concerned about suffering of animals, I would focus on the bio-industry. And the food industry. That's what I would focus on. There are millions of cows living in disastrous or very bad circumstances. Pigs and many animals have very bad conditions to live in. And I would put my attention on that instead of the loss of biodiversity. So biodiversity loss and the suffering of animals is not really, not very well connected. But maybe humans suffer because of biodiversity loss. And this idea that humans suffer because of diversity loss falls all under the word of ecosystem services. And ecosystem services are the services that are provided by us, to us by nature. And the idea is that the more diverse nature is, the better these services are provided. What kind of services are there? Well, purification of the air, prevention of erosion, pollination of crops, storage of carbon dioxide, all kinds of services that nature provides us will be provided better by a diverse nature. That's the idea. Clear? And if the diversity of nature decreases, then those services, well, will diminish and that will cause suffering to us. This whole idea that these services will be provided better to us by a diverse nature is actually quite peculiar. Why would that be the case? Why would a natural nature provide better services to us than a nature that is tuned to our wishes and is less diverse? Nature used to provide the service of transportation to us via horses. Yeah, that's what nature did. But nowadays, we have a dedicated service engineered completely by us, and it's cars and bicycles. And they provide us this service way better than the natural form of transportation of horses. It was pure luck that we fitted on horse and could sit there. But it's the idea that what nature gives us is optimal is actually a very weird idea. Normally, things that are perfectly tuned for us provide way better services than the way it by nature is. Yeah? So the whole idea that biodiversity, that ecosystem services will be provided better by us by a diverse nature is actually, from a philosophical point of view, I think, quite peculiar. But okay, let's focus on one particular example that is always used to make the point, and that's of bees, honeybees particularly. Yeah? Honeybees are important to us. They do the pollination of all kinds of crops that we need for our food. If biodiversity decreases, then this might also hurt honeybees. Hence, if biodiversity decreases, we have nothing to eat anymore. Yeah, that's the intuition, and you hear that argumentation quite often in the media and all kinds of publications. I hope you remember that. Yeah? There are all kinds of difficulties in this particular reasoning. One are the facts, is that indeed it is true that the honeybee is responsible for quite some for the pollination of quite some crops that we use. Not of the staple crops, wheat, rice, potatoes. That we don't need any pollination for that. It just runs by the wind. Yeah, so we don't. For those foods, we don't need insects. For the other foods, for some foods like apples, almonds, pears, melons, we need pollination, particularly honeybees. And honeybees alone will do. They will do fine. But pollination works better if you have more bees around. So if you have more bees, more different bees, then it works better. Then you get nicer apples, you get more expensive apples, then well, it works a little better. So diversity of bees is indeed profitable for us, and if the bee diversity would go down, this would cause suffering of humans, meaning that our apples will be more expensive. That will be our suffering, which also is suffering. Yeah, I count that also in suffering. If apples become so expensive that people hardly can buy apples anymore, then I think we might call that a disaster. However, this reasoning works for bees, and is not at all generalized to other organisms. There's no reason to believe that the diversity of fig wasps, that's the topic of my wife, is somehow connected to services that nature provides us. There's no reason. There are 700 different fig wasps. They live in the rainforest. And fig wasps are also insects. They are like this. They also do pollination of figs. We don't eat those figs. So change the diversity of that group of species from 700 to 350, that's a huge difference, and nothing will happen to any service provided to us by nature. Nature does provide all kinds of services to us. And it's very stupid to destroy the species that are responsible for those services. But it's an illusion to think that all species around are connected to some species. I mean, lots of species just can be removed from nature, and still we will have all those services that are provided to us by nature. There's one picture that I use here, and this is the robo-bee. And actually, it's a difficulty of the argument that nature gives us those services, and hence, or thus, we should take care for nature. This whole argument vanishes if we have an alternative that is better. If you have an alternative that works better than regular bees, in this case robo-bees, then the whole argument just loses its power. So the risk of the argument that a diverse nature provides us all the services, the risk of the argument is that if we have a better service that's artificial, then whoop, we have no reasons to keep the bees anymore. So people who use this argument to save biodiversity should know this. There's a risk in this particular argument. So in the end, if we deal with suffering, then I don't see any reasons to believe, and I just gave you one example, the bee example, but there are lots of similar examples. I have no reasons to believe that the loss of biodiversity will cause the suffering of either animals, of humans. So the second option of a disaster just can be well, weggevinkt. It can be striped out, and I don't go for that one. So there is a final option now, and the final option is the loss of biodiversity is a disaster just by itself. Yeah, that's a more philosophical perspective, and that's, you know, all the diversity in nature is going down. that is a disaster in itself. Yeah, and that's the third option I want to discuss. 5 more minutes, is that okay? And then, so I put this away, and I end with that. I wanted to consider 2 options. One is, so we're discussing, is it maybe so that the loss of biodiversity is a disaster by itself? This is thinkable if biodiversity is something of extremely high value. Yeah? If something of very high value goes down or isn't there anymore, then we feel that as a disaster. Just take an example, as an example, the Mona Lisa. The Mona Lisa is something that we consider of very high value. If the Mona Lisa disappears from our planet, I think most of us will consider that disastrous, yeah, because it has a very high value. Now, what kind of value is the value of biodiversity? And I want to consider 2 options. One is a preference, something that we just like, or maybe it's something moral. These are 2 different things. First, the first option, it's just something that we like. We like biodiversity, and we like it very much, just like we like the Mona Lisa. Yeah? It's an option. Now, I doubt very much if we value biodiversity really very highly. And I have some pictures to make my point. This is a picture of Bali rice fields. Yeah? Quite some people go there on vacation because they like it so much. This is a disaster from the point of view of a biologist. This is extremely bio-poor area. It's a sort of monoculture. It's only rice that grows there, plus some other organisms that fit with the particular rice. It's a monoculture. It's an extremely simple ecosystem. It's quite stable. Right? These ecosystems are there already for centuries, I think. I'm not sure about that, but at least decades. They're there, and it's one of the highlights of Bali are these rice fields. So people like this, and it's extremely bio-poor. It's not biodiverse. I agree that we have a preference for some biodiversity. Most of us will like biodiversity. We prefer a biodiverse nature in contrast to a bio-poor nature. But some bio-poor natures, like this one, are also quite fine, actually, for most people. This is another example. This is the kind of grasslands that I look to from the window of my house. I live in North Holland, and I see only meadows. I like this very much. It looks nice. And for me, it's beautiful. Biologists think that this is a disaster because of the loss of biodiversity that occurred exactly here. This is very bio-poor area. It's only grass. And decades ago, there used to live all kinds of small weeds and birds that are no longer anymore there. And they think it's a disaster because they have a preference of a more diverse meadow. But for me, it's not a disaster. And since we're discussing preferences, there's no reason to consider the ideas of a hypothetical biologist higher than my preferences. They're just preferences. I prefer this. Someone else has different preferences. And if I say that it is not a disaster, then who is someone else to say that it is a disaster? Yeah, we're just discussing preferences. The one can prefer that particular chair. Someone else has a preference for another chair. It's just a matter of taste, more or less. And for me, this is very fine. Yeah, I don't have any problems there. Or the final example of this particular... Oh, I think something went wrong. Ah, yeah, this is secondary, so-called secondary rainforest. This is the kind of rainforest that my wife studies. This is also a disaster, according to the ideas of some specialists who know a lot of rainforests, since this is boring rainforest compared to the original rainforest. Original rainforest, I'm not sure if I have also a picture of that. Oh, no, I didn't have a picture of that.
Oh, no.
Now it went wrong, isn't it? I shouldn't do this. Okay. I hope you have in mind this last picture of the... Yeah, of this rain. We keep this one, yeah? This is a secondary rainforest, and that's rainforest that was clear-cut a couple of decades ago, and it grew back like this. And it feels like really rainforest. You know, it's very cool rainforest, and it's studied by scientists, and if I walk through it, it feels like rainforest, but it's not at all the diverse rainforest that used to be there. Yeah, it's not at all that kind of rainforest, a different kind of rainforest. For me, it's rainforest. So other people have a preference for the other rainforest. I also like this rainforest, and I think preference is not a good argument for biodiversity. Actually, most of us don't want that much biodiversity. We want some biodiversity, or we want the diversity of specific kinds. We want rhinos, we want pandas, we want elephants, we want tigers, we want specific diversity, but we don't want all biodiversity. Most of us won't prefer 700 fig wasps over 350 fig wasps. I mean, you won't care, I guess, except the people who study fig wasps do care. But most people don't care. So preferences are not really helping biodiversity. You know, if your concept of value is that you prefer something, if the idea is biodiversity has very high value, and hence its loss is disastrous, and this biodiversity has this high value because of the fact we prefer it so much, we like it so much, then I don't think this is a proper argument. There is another option of the idea that biodiversity loss is disastrous, and that's the whole idea of a moral obligation. Maybe we have a moral obligation towards biodiversity. Maybe it is disastrous, not because of just a preference, but because of something deeper. And this is ethics. Yeah? We have the freedom of speech in the Western world, not because we prefer it, but because of deeper reasons. We strongly feel that it's very wise and good to have a freedom of speech. Maybe the same holds for diversity. Maybe it is so that we strongly and deeply feel that we have the obligation to keep biodiversity at its current state, something like that. And if that is so, then the loss of biodiversity is indeed disastrous, just as disastrous as would be the loss of the freedom of speech. Clear? So is it so that we have this moral obligation towards diversity or towards species? That would be something very strange. Normally, we have moral obligations to other living entities. I don't have a moral obligation towards my notebook, for example. Yeah? I can do this with my notebook. I'm going to do that, I hope. Yeah? I can do this, and no one will say, this is incorrect, this is a disaster. You know, it was just a notebook. It's not living, and the same holds for chairs and other non-living things. Now, another illusion that many people have about species and about biodiversity is that they think it's a living entity somehow. And they somehow equate the organisms with species. But that's an equation which is incorrect. A species is a category, and an organism is a living thing. But species don't live. Biodiversity doesn't live either. You can compare biodiversity to something like prime numbers. We don't have a moral obligation towards prime numbers either. It would be very strange to have a moral obligation towards prime numbers. There's no reason to have that particular moral obligation. There are non-living entities towards we have a moral obligation, or that have rights, for example. A well-known example is a river in New Zealand. And this river is given the rights of an individual, and the consequence is that humans may not pollute the river anymore, because that would harm the river. And that is quite strange. And it would be possible to think of biodiversity like that river. However, I strongly believe that that river has the rights not because of the river, but because of the people living near the river. Actually, those have the rights on the river. And I think that if those people just move to another place, then the river will lose its particular rights. So I don't think that we usually have moral obligations to rivers, nor to prime numbers, and neither to categories like species, nor towards a property of those categories like biodiversity. I don't see why we can have moral obligations to those concepts. So we had three options of disaster. One, disaster is connected to to collapse. Yeah? I have no reasons to assume that that is going to happen. Secondly, biodiversity loss or disaster is connected to suffering. I have no reasons to believe that biodiversity loss is going to cause severe suffering. And thirdly, maybe the loss of biodiversity is a disaster by itself. I have no reasons to believe that that is a very wise idea to work from. So my conclusion is that I don't see any reasons to think that the loss of biodiversity is going to cause a disaster. And if people, and it would be wise for people to be honest about their agendas. People say, or I suspect that people say that biodiversity loss is connected to disasters because they love biodiversity so much. They have a personal preference for biodiversity. They just like it. They love biodiversity. Well, be honest about that. Say clearly, I love biodiversity. I love these fake wasps. I love these creatures. I love the most strange creatures around. I want all the species that exist. I want them to survive just because of me. I like them. And that would be the honest argument. But I don't believe people who say that biodiversity loss is going to cause a disaster. Punt.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bas, for exposing. I was listening to you, and I mean, I thought about this a little bit in advance. You exposed it in me, or at least, you know, thinking about this, listening to you, exposed in me the realization that indeed I have sort of an irrational, just assumed idea that this is really important, that biodiversity has this value. And I think that is good. And listening to you say these things, actually, you know, as a biologist, it almost hurts.
Yeah.
I kind of like it. I'm a bit of a masochist in this respect, so it's okay.
Actually, I never realized this beforehand. I thought it was very clear, but I do now know that biologists feel like that.
You will find a lot of opposition because you are saying things that are not done.
Yeah.
And yeah, so at least in many circles, many circles. So, but nonetheless, I want to explore a little bit with you some of the things that you said. We can sit down. We can stand. Shall we sit down?
Yeah, let's sit down. What to do with this chair? Shall I remove it back?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. If that feels okay. You don't have a moral obligation.
No, it's fine.
Will you sit there? I'll sit here?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. So maybe starting with you know, human suffering as a consequence of a loss of biodiversity. So if we sort of assume that much of this, or if we look at the emotional side of things, right? We love biodiversity, at least many.
You do, as a biologist.
I do. So I have a question then. How big is your love for biodiversity? And
not so big, to be honest. No.
But
I like nature very, very much. But I like the secondary rainforest just as much as the primary rainforest.
But is there not a conceptual? So is there not something? I have this feeling that you know, the primary rainforest. It has a beauty to me that is indeed this. I don't know if I've ever seen it in real life. Even, you know, I've seen it on TV. But when you say this, it kind of hurts.
Yeah.
You don't have that? Not at all?
No, not at all. No, I like nature, really. I live in nature, I walk in nature, and I like nature. But, you know, I also know something about it, that this diversity is in all kinds of creatures that have very technical differences to other creatures. So biodiversity for 90% refers to creatures that really have no meaning to me.
We don't know about them?
No. And no, I don't care. No, sorry.
You really don't care? No. Okay. That's cold. I find that cold.
Yeah, you might find it cold, yeah.
Cold, yeah. Okay, so is it, do you think that this suffering by people like me, I'm exaggerating maybe a little bit, right? But, I mean, some people have climate stress. This is something that I don't suffer from, but I don't tend to be too stressed about these kinds of things. But I can imagine that this, grave loss of biodiversity. I read it or saw that a UN document appeared that spoke of a million plant and animal species being on the verge of extinction. Let's assume that we will lose them, right? And let's assume that doesn't cause a collapse of any relevant ecosystems. But just that idea that we're living in a time, that hurts me and probably hurts a lot of people.
Yeah, but it's a completely logical consequence of our being. It's a consequence of the fact that we have that we need agriculture to eat, and that a significant percentage of the surface of our planet is there for us to eat. Now, food is also a very important value, and if I have to choose between either the option of eating, of having 700 fig wasps instead of 350, I immediately vote for eating. That's way more important for me. So it's a completely logical consequence.
But do you know who here feels a bit like me that this loss of species would be, painful in some way, would cause suffering?
Yeah.
So there you go. Let's say there's 50% of the people here, or maybe even more, think that they will suffer. They don't know this, right?
No, wait, they will,
or maybe you are already suffering.
I think you will suffer because of the extinction of a tiger and a rhino. You will suffer because of that. That's very clear.
So what is the value of a tiger, of preventing?
Those are the ones that we deeply feel connected with.
Yeah.
And these are the ones that definitely need our protection because we love those. But biodiversity...
But I would argue, I agree with your, it's an interesting argument, that species are not a living thing, right?
Yeah.
But I like to also say that living things, or recognizing the distinction, making the distinction between living and lifeless is equally artificial, right? So yeah, I'm going there, yeah. So I would say that's a non-argument, that we can have a moral obligation towards living things and not to non-living things. I think that I guess you have to accept the idea that this distinction between living and lifeless is artificial. But
the distinction between categories and items within those categories is not artificial. It's really you have something like car brand.
But you limit moral obligations to living things.
Yeah,
that's quite
the usual thing. That's the usual way. For example, we have nowadays learning software, and learning software doesn't have the right for education, for example. We humans have the right for education, and learning software doesn't have the right for education. It's just learning software. It's fine, you can also include the non-living items in our moral obligations, but then we are
like the river.
Like the river, but then then actually, if you do that, then you have a different perspective on our world, and we see an explosion of diversity. We see you see the chairs that we sit on? They were not there 100 years ago. We see an explosion of all kinds of new things that weren't there 100 years ago.
We all become collectors,
it's such a diverse world now. We have poetry, recipes that weren't there, words, rap music.
Yeah, we should. That would, I mean.
Yeah,
losing public enemy would be a huge, painful loss to me, at least.
Okay.
Let's move on.
Maybe I met you there.
Possibly. You mentioned that biologists like to use the economy as a metaphor, and you also acknowledge that it's a meaningful metaphor. I'm going to attack the metaphor. I know it can be difficult, but I'm going to do it. So basically, how would you respond to me saying that that just like in an economy, losing, for example, different entities that produce the same thing, so having a degree of redundancy, can actually I could envisage that weakening an economy to external perturbation, etc.
Yeah, that's true.
So that also then would go...
No, it's very
right?
true. If you remove all the car factories from our economies, then you have a problem. Then
or if you reduce it to one.
Yeah.
Right, that becomes sensitive.
That's really sensitive. You shouldn't do that. They did that so with bananas, and
So you fully acknowledge that element.
10 around,
but not
but not.
Okay, so I sense I sense that I mean, you do recognize that biodiversity, do you recognize there is a minimal level of biodiversity that we need?
Clearly.
Okay.
Oh, clearly. But let's look at the rainforest, the primary rainforest. If you look at the primary rainforest from say a satellite, you see actually that it's a lot of, you can observe it as little islands with its specific diversity. You know, it's there because of niches and specific, well, different theories. But it's just all kinds of islands with different diversities. Just remove that and have one island instead of a lot of small islands, and it's just as stable. It's just as stable.
And then I want to continue on this, right? So ecosystems are complex. I take it you agree, right? The interactions are really complex. We at present do not at all, we cannot even begin to understand what's going on completely there. So predicting their stability is very difficult.
Yeah.
And how can we know that this minimal level of biodiversity, or where that minimal level of diversity that you also agree, you know, we need, where that is?
Yeah, we don't know that.
So we really don't know.
No,
so,
but the nasty thing, what happens in nature actually is not that, you know, the global level of diversity is going down. But locally, on most areas of the world, biodiversity is actually going up, strangely enough. And it's just a consequence of us. We homogenize the world, but locally, biodiversity is not going down so much. It's just more of the same we have on our planet. And there are no reasons to believe that it's less stable than it used to be before. I mean, and we have never seen a collapse of an ecosystem because of biodiversity loss. We never have seen that. So why assume that something like that?
This is a new thing, right? I mean, people back in the day might have said, we've never seen, well, ignorant people back in the day might have said, we've never seen climate change. This can never happen. Surely, this is crazy.
But there were all kinds of models predicting climate change because of you know, there's a causal mechanism explaining climate change because of the increase of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
I agree. In that sense, it's not a complex system. It's reasonably straightforward.
For the same token, it's the other way around.
But would you agree that we don't know how... I mean, we've never pushed extinction as hard as...
Oh, yeah, but we have lots of experience in changing the natural surroundings dramatically. I mean, look at the surface of the Netherlands. It is dramatically different compared to 200 years ago. I mean, there's no nature left. We changed the surface so hugely, nothing happened. Nothing. There is an island in the ocean that I just happened to visit a couple of years ago. It's called Niue, and there's nothing in the surroundings for 1,000 kilometers, and it's a very, very small. There are hurricanes, and it's really it's a very harsh area, and still there's all kinds of nature. We came there, we changed the surface, and still all kinds of plants grow there. You should realize that plants have well, that's evolution gave them the property of reproducing continuously. It's what all those individuals share. They reproduce continuously.
True. But there could be a limit, a lower limit where it becomes very sensitive, right? For example, in the case of marine wildlife, fishing has pushed some populations to the verge of real collapse. This is human activity.
Everything all the time, then it's very clear that something...
So you would agree that that's a case where we have actively reduced biodiversity in a way.
But that's not biodiversity that we're influencing. We are influencing biomass in the seas. You know, we're removing all living things continuously. It would be the same as clear-cutting a forest every year. Well, it's quite evident, after a couple of years, you won't have anything left anymore, since you cut away everything. That's clear.
But isn't that what is happening in some places in the world, that people are really cutting away?
Yeah, that's not something that you shouldn't do that. But that's not biodiversity loss. That's the loss of nature at all. That's just removing nature. Well, if you remove nature, then you don't have any nature in the future. And that's
okay. So you make a distinction between just the gross destruction of nature, and I don't know. Are those really two separate things?
Yeah,
destroying nature, and that's how we, the way humans reduce species diversity on our planet is just by, we don't go out and go like, we're going to go for that fig wasp, right? No, we invent some new toxic anti-whatever compound, and we spray it everywhere, and then later on it turns out it kills 80% of...
The major force behind biodiversity loss, also according to this UN report, is agriculture. That's why it started this. That's what we do, you know. We cut away the forest and we put back corn or something like that. And that has effects on nature. It has a drastically different composition, namely of this crop plant that we like so much, in contrast to the diversity of trees that used to grow there. But the idea is this a disaster? So
I mean, you have a lot of confidence in the resilience of the existing biodiversity to reduction of that biodiversity.
That I find that the confidence is more at the... It's my job to doubt. Yeah. And I strongly feel that there should be more doubt at the other side. So when they claim in newspapers, this is a real disaster, then I think I strongly doubt that. I need arguments for that. And secretly, the argument very often is the intuition of it's a whole system, remove some parts and the system will collapse. So
we don't understand it, at least from my point of view. I just admitted to having this irrational idea. When I started studying biology, I had the same irrational idea about the risks of genetic modification. Yeah. And I've been doing it my entire professional career, and nothing happened. So that completely changed. So I think I see where you're coming from. You mention in your essay the possibility, if I understand it correctly, that biologists are biased by this too. Right? The very people that study these very complicated systems and are also studying the effects of biodiversity on ecosystem stability are possibly also affected by or infected by this idea that there's some intrinsic value to, and you basically tell them, you know, to be honest. How could we approach this? Because it could be true. I did a quick search. I used some keywords, and I found 40 papers that dealt with biodiversity, ecosystems, and stability. Yeah. And I counted, well, some of them I had to dismiss. I think I ended up with 17 papers. 13 of them said there was a positive correlation. Yeah, right? Correlation. Yeah, correlation. 2 of them said it can be both positive and negative. Yeah. And one had that U-shaped relationship that I think you were also referring to, which is I think a very interesting point if you want to sort of depolarize this discussion, right? It's not good or bad. It depends. Yeah. And then one of them even reported a negative correlation. But well, 2 questions. How big do you think this effect could be? Do you have a feeling for it? And what could we do to have a constructive discussion about this or to counteract this? The constructive discussion is very difficult. Let me give you an example. Alexander Pyron is a well-known biologist who has a column in the Washington Post. Wrote 2 years ago a column saying, well, this whole idea of biodiversity, you know, actually, I was trained to find it important, but I know a little bit more about it nowadays. It's my job to study it, and let's take a more fair approach towards this concept. You should, by the way, realize it's a political term. It's not a scientific term originally, but okay. I'm going to ask you something about that.
So he wrote a column about it in the Washington Post. There were 4,000 responses, or there was one letter actually signed by 4,000 people from the entire world, specifically from the academics, stating in the Washington Post that this guy, this Alexander Pyron, should be expelled from university, all his funds should be withdrawn, and he should be not allowed to be a scientist anymore. Since this is not the kind of questions we want to be asked. We don't want this question to be asked. That was the content of the letter. I contacted him, and he said, I never deal with this anymore. I just study snakes. That's fine. That's safe. That's what I'm doing. So it's very difficult to make this an open discussion. That's one. Second, for the question of how large is the correlation, is I have no clue. But the thing is, I'm not interested in correlations, but in causations. Correlations are very bad explanations of things. Suppose, just give me an example, suppose someone studies, there is some disease connected to food. Possibly there is some ingredient in the food causing this disease, but scientists don't know what is causing this disease. Then they're going to study the diet that people take and the chance of getting this particular disease. I guarantee you there will be a positive correlation between getting the disease and the diversity of the food that they eat. Clearly, since if you eat a diverse meal, then you have a higher chance of having this ingredient that makes you sick. But to say that there's a causal relation between diversity and getting this disease, it would be bullcrap. No one would believe that.
But to say the opposite, of course, is also bullcrap, right? Okay.
But then concluding from a correlation that there is a causation is, to me, a bridge too far. You should look at the effects, what is causing what, and that's your obligation as a scientist.
True, but some of these studies actually have, create so-called microcosms. They create artificial systems that they perturb in a really sort of replicated, experimented way, and then those correlations have a lot of value, at least, pointing at causation. I mean, you do not deny the possibility that diversity is a factor, right? You don't deny this, right? If I understand correctly.
But then you also have to. How many species do you need, and do you need more than 10? And more than 10 is, in those experiments, very often quite okay already. More is not helping too much.
Okay. So just because you mentioned it, that biologists and in science, biodiversity is not, is not a concept that is used and useful, but rather biodiversity is here to convince people of the importance of biodiversity and keep, people that like to cuddle animals happy. This is not true, I think. I mean, biologists have a Shannon index. Biologists have various ways to quantify genetic diversity. It is used in many studies. Darwin and all evolutionary biologists after him have studied biodiversity and tried to figure it out. And you're telling me that this is not a scientific concept.
But don't you know the story of biodiversity, of the word biodiversity?
No, I don't.
No?
Enlighten us.
No, really?
No, honestly, I don't.
It's actually quite interesting. There was a conference in 1983 organized by Edward O. Wilson and W.G. Rosen, a very unknown biologist who also happened to be a marketeer. The term used was biological diversity. It was for nature conservation. It was just the diversity of nature, biological conservation. But as W.G. Rosen knew that the word logical refers to ratio, whereas he thought, if we want to tell the conservation story, then we need to address emotions. So I just removed the word logical. So I'm going to change the word biological diversity into biodiversity. And since then, you can see it has been studied substantially by people who study science. You see an increase of the importance of the term of biodiversity. So it was an invented term by a scientific marketeer.
Okay, so I never realized you make the distinction between biological diversity and biodiversity.
Well, you see biodiversity, since its invention you see it explode in the academic papers.
I see this, but biodiversity biodiversity meaning biological diversity is a concept that is used to do proper science.
When Darwin asked himself, where do species, on the origin of species, he was discussing, this diversity
about biological diversity, right? So I would say be careful there. I mean, it's an interesting...
But the term biodiversity
Okay, I was not aware of this. Okay, I think it's time to wrap up at least this conversation and open up the floor for questions from the audience. Let's see if there's something... Yeah, maybe, I mean... Making the comparison to global warming, right?
Yeah.
I could argue or try to argue against what you're doing, even call what you are doing extremely dangerous. You're providing, the future deniers of declines or at least people that deny some importance of biological diversity. You're giving them ammunition. How would you respond to
I would respond to that.
It's irresponsible, I would say.
No, I go for good reasonings. I go for proper reasonings, and I go for scientific scrutiny. And if you say that the consequence of scientific scrutiny is that some misunderstandings do not longer exist in the future, and I say, okay, fine, And even if people say, okay, they can misuse your arguments, for example, for climate change, and people say that, and okay, then they misinterpret completely what I say, and that's not my problem. That's really not what I should deal with. I deal with putting on the table the arguments that some people use, and I want to know what they really mean. That's my job as a philosopher. And I think that in the end makes the world better instead of worse.
Okay, on that note, thanks for this conversation. Other questions from the audience? All right, we start here in the front.
I just remain sitting, yeah? Is it okay?
Yeah, that's fine. Here you go.
Yes, thank you, first of all, for a talk. I have a question and reaction on both the second and the third part, the definition for disaster. So the suffering, and especially the service provided for humans, and the disaster of biodiversity loss in itself. Because I study life science and technology here at the TU Delft, and as in biotechnology, we use biology as a toolbox. And I think there are also many other engineers that use nature as inspiration, because all those billions years of evolutions probably has a better solution that we can think of right now. So isn't a loss in biodiversity a big disaster in, for example, the antibiotics that were invented by looking at nature?
Yeah, that's a very well possibility, and that's also an argument. And the argument, let's use the argument for medicine in general. Yeah, or do you want to focus it on antibiotics per se?
Go for it.
Okay. And the argument then is as follows: well, we need medicines. They come from nature sometimes, and we inspire those medicines on nature. And shouldn't we keep nature? This is actually an economic argument, hoping for a future value in contrast to a current nowadays value. So you have the option, okay, either clear-cut this part of nature that hosts possibly all kinds of diversity, but instead we get food back now. The chance, and it's economics, the chance of there in that part of nature being or living a creature that gives us this medicine is not that much that pharmaceutical industries invent in those patches of nature. They don't do that because they think, well, we go for other options. We go for synthesis of all kinds of molecules instead of using the rainforest, since that's not working. So that's a drawback of your argument. Would you say no?
Yeah, I do not really agree, because I think many of the pharmaceutical products right now are inspired by molecules that are found in nature. We still find it very hard to design proteins ourselves as humans. We still cannot do that. And it's not only medicines, it's also wastewater treatment. It's, I think the group here on my left can say a lot more, but there's a lot more than just medicines. And isn't it a really easy short-term fix to go for the food? And isn't it a big risk for a disaster to discard the possible long-term benefits that a big biodiversity can give us as humans?
Yeah, but still it's an economic argument, and you should do the calculation. Okay, what is the chance of this
but life-saving chemical in the nature? If it is substantial? I mean, there's really, I mean, biotechnologists are indeed actively sampling from genetic diversity in nature to construct things that are useful, right?
Yeah.
So,
but there are all kinds of ways to do that, and how they, for example, do that. Just they collect it, and they say, okay, now we have enough for the next 1,000 years, and they keep it, and then you can change the rainforest into
no, because when a species goes extinct, its genome goes extinct, and those specific building blocks. You know, if you sort of take the synthetic biology mindset, right? Then you look at nature, and all you see are building blocks that you can use to create your useful life form. Yeah. Right. That resource, whenever you know,
true. But still
steadily diminishes.
Yeah. But then I really doubt. You know, I don't know if this argument is an argument used to protect nature, which you actually just want. Or you really...
Well, these things are not mutually exclusive, right?
No, they're not mutually, but if you
want to
look
be
at
happy
the data,
and look at nature, but he wants to just create new synthetic life forms.
But look at the figures. Look at, I just happened to see the top 100 medicines prescribed in the world, and I remember only the top 20, and there is one medicine from some viper, and that's about it. The rest is just sheep, dogs, horses. They also have very interesting molecules to build new medicines with. and you don't need all the diversity that's around. Or that's just the data, yeah? I'm only referring to the data. Look at the data. Then you see that the top 20 of used medicines, they don't rely on the rainforest. But still, it might be the case that there is a secret molecule in the rainforest that we destroy by removing the rainforest. That's okay. I would go for the risk.
And we destroy. I think
Yeah.
it's a very, very strong point.
Yeah, well, there's also a counterpart of this particular argument. There used to be a case of some trees giving this cancer medicine. I forgot the name of. Maybe you know what medicine I refer to. It's a very well-known case of an anti-cancer molecule. They found it in nature, and they now need a lot of trees to grow for that medicine. So as a consequence of finding this one particular tree in nature, they had to clear-cut huge parts of the forests to make it into large areas to grow that particular...
And that's why, especially, that's why I think that the biodiversity is so important, because we can look at the tree, and the tree makes one molecule that is very useful to cure cancer. Then we can take that molecule, take the gene for it, and put it in a yeast cell, for instance, and make it in a big tank. Yeah. But that is only possible because the biodiversity was there in the first place, and because in one of those many trees in the rainforest, there was one tree who made the molecule that can cure cancer. A bit of a big statement.
Your argument sounds to me a bit like the following: is that say that I bought a ticket of a lottery, yeah, and I win a prize, given that ticket. Where do I owe that prize to? I think I owe it to the fact that exactly that number was true. I don't owe it to the diversity of numbers. I don't say, because of the diversity of numbers, I have this one ticket. It might be so that indeed, in the future, we get prizes because of biodiversity. It might be so. And yes, that is a good argument. I strongly doubt that the economics of the argument, the economic argument, are convincing. That's just a doubt, but I completely go with your argument. Yes, it is a proper argument.
Let's leave this.
Doubt the economics of the argument.
Yeah, let's leave this question. Thank you very much for raising it. Other questions, and you are allowed to throw the mic around.
Yeah. Thanks for the talk. To be honest, I find it super narrow-minded, and
told you.
And a bit single-sided on the cause-effect examples you bring. Why biodiversity is something that we can not really, that we don't really need. And I think one disturbing fact is that you describe the humans as a segregated kind of being that is kind of steering its environment in the way that it's just useful. And this usefulness is then linked to values that you, for example, have, and you describe there's a field in front of your house, and you personally enjoy that. So tomorrow comes a bulldozer, makes it all, I don't know, squared, 70th Soviet Union housing blocks. What about your value then? And the fact that what he said, that we don't understand yet biodiversity and how natural systems function, what actually is the root cause of natural progression or natural balanced state, and then arguing from this point of view that just we don't need it now, we can just remove this 300 fig fly species, and it doesn't have any, then a value comes all of a sudden up in your philosophical discussion with what is a value, what is good and bad, what is the decision you make on preferences, and to me it appears it's a big confusion. And there's also not any numbers, and it appears to me you have an inner kind of discussion with your wife, who's a biologist, who maybe always argues towards you, and you try to find more arguments. I don't want to get personal, but it appears to me it's a big mess.
Yeah.
So,
the interesting thing is that I realize that many people feel not comfortable by me stating these things. But the interesting thing is that if you are a biologist and you say, this is so valuable, something happened in this meadow, then that is also a subjective value. So you say to me, you are very narrow-minded because you have only your perspective of value. Whereas you don't say that to the biologist, who is just as subjective. And that's the only thing I want to say. If we're dealing with this kind of thing, we are very narrow-minded, all of us. Also the biologists who say that this is so important, and that's the only point I'm making.
Yeah, okay, that's true, because you can then, when the biologist values something higher than you, and it's just a personal value of him, and based on his knowledge that he finds it more interesting, and he can study it, maybe it pays him a salary, fine. But is, for you, biodiversity, is it a cause or is it an effect? Because you pick this thing in a big chain of life. Yeah. You know, and in my opinion, biodiversity is a consequence.
It is
right. It's not a cause for something, and when we lose it, just we can get rid of it, and everything will be fine. It is a consequence of a lot of factors that we don't understand, and to just remove that, like from a very anthropocentric point of view, is just, for me, without it makes not really sense. You gave this example of, okay, we don't need the honeybees to produce our crops. We can just use these little bee robots. But the engineer who develops these bee robots maybe looks first at a bee to actually understand how this thing flies and how it pollinates the flower. So when the bee is gone, how you invent these technologies then?
I didn't say that this is possible yet. I just said that it's a drawback for the argument.
Good,
It's just a drawback for the particular argument. If you make an argument that this is so important because the service relies on it, then you should realize that just a formal aspect of the argument is that if there is an alternative for this property, then your argument is gone. That's just it's a formal property of the argument. That's what I said. Not that we will have robo-bees in the future, I don't know. But just it's a drawback of the argument. The same holds for, I gave this a fake example, but it just also makes the point. People say that we feel very healthy in forests, and that's why we should keep forests. Now suppose that some scientist shows that plastic green things just work as well, then the argument is gone. That's a formal aspect of the argument. And you might find it narrow-minded, but okay, that's just a formal aspect of arguments.
No.
I suggest we move on to another question. So feel free to pass the mic to anyone who you like.
No worries. Okay. Thank you for your talk. You gave me some new insights, I think. But to start with, I really like biology and biodiversity. I love it. And one of the reasons for that is that it's unpredictable in a way, which I really like. And I think that's also one of the problems, because if you look at the world, maybe there is a world in the future where we only need a few crops and maybe don't need the honeybees. But in that case, we assume that we know how everything works and how an ecosystem is together, but we don't know the individual roles of some organisms. And I think that taking away organisms might have an impact that you cannot really realize. And maybe an example for that is not taking away an organism, but introducing an organism. For example, in the Victoria Lake, where they introduced a newer, bigger, fatter fish, which might lead to extra food for the people living around the lake. But in the end, the fish ate a smaller fish, and then there was no food anymore, the fish died, and there was no food for the people anymore, which is a big biodiversity loss with a big impact on the people living around the lake. And yeah, maybe we should preserve it as long as we don't really know how everything works, which is the current case, I guess. Yeah, but the interesting thing is that we say this, for example, we say this typically when it comes to biodiversity, we don't say this with rewilding, just the word. You know, we don't know what the effects of rewilding are. Still, we just do it and say, okay, that's good to have an area and we rewilder it, and we don't know what's going to happen, but it's interesting. No one says, let's not do that because we don't know what happens. So there is a bias towards biodiversity that the uncertainty argument, we don't, and the precautionary argument just applies to biodiversity, but applies not to other things we're not sure about. That's one. And secondly, let's say that I'm a lay person in biology, and I see people from biology saying, well, we have these species, they make a whole system, and we don't know what happens if we remove some of the diversity. Maybe something will happen. And I, as a lay person, would say, okay, please sketch me the possibilities,
and let's discuss how bad they are. Since changes are not per se bad, it might be the case that remove some species from an ecosystem and things will happen. There are quite some examples of how that occurs, and that occurs all the time. But it's not to biologists to judge that this is a bad thing, just to change. Can I give you one example?
Yeah, sure.
I did a lot of my work in Panama, in the rainforest, and I was looking through an example of a collapse. Of an example where the loss of species caused a collapse. So I was just curious, I want to see an example of that. And it was quite difficult to find one, but luckily I found one in Panama itself. In the Panama Canal, it was a very small island of only a hectare, of even smaller in size. And some predators that used to live there were removed, or just are not there anymore a couple of decades ago. And it had severe consequences on the island, and it's called an Armageddon. No, it's not a meltdown in a scientific article. Meltdown. Yeah? I've seen it, and it was just as large as the other islands. However, in the eyes of the biologist, it was a meltdown because some specific species weren't there anymore. It was so. If biologists are uncertain, and they say, well, we are not certain, maybe the consequence is bad, please allow me to also be part of the discussion, what is bad? Biologists don't determine what is bad. Other people also determine it. And I didn't find it bad, what happened to that island in the Panama Canal, whereas biologists called it a meltdown, a biological meltdown. That's something that's even worse than a disaster. Please allow me to also judge that particular case. So I go for you, yeah, there are uncertainties, and it might be so that they have consequences that are not foreseen. But other people that are not biologists should also have a say in how bad these consequences then are.
Yeah, but I find the case where people don't have the food anymore from the lake
that's
a pretty bad consequence.
No, that's a very bad consequence. I agree with it completely.
Yeah, and for now we don't really know what will happen when the bees, for example, will get extinct. We don't know if that will ever happen. And the consequences might be more severe than just having to use robotic bees for...
Yeah, but then, yeah.
And I think just,
in the future, it's very... for fish, there's way more cultivated fish nowadays, and then you don't have this particular problem. But if you live from fish in... No, it's going up, isn't it? But it's... But isn't it tilapia? That's one of tilapia. That's one of the most consumed fish. It's vegetables. Is it tilapia? And pangasius? No, they eat vegetables.
There's a huge industry for sardines.
Yeah.
Fish meal, then fed to the aquaculture.
Yeah, but tilapia and pangasius, they're on the rise. I don't know if they are the most eaten fishes nowadays. They eat vegetables just as cultivated salmon also nowadays.
It would be nice to bring some numbers next time where you can clearly see.
Actually, I'm a philosopher. I'm not in the. I'm for the quality of data, not of the quality of analysis, and not of the numbers. Yeah. So everyone his job or her job.
More questions. So pass the mic to anyone you like. I'm citing the Beastie Boys.
I have several comments, to be honest. First, I would like to thank you for the nuancing of the term of biodiversity. But going from there, I have a lot of criticism, if I'm honest, because even though you use the economy and the idea of the economy being a harsh libertarian, I mean the ecosystems being more akin to harsh libertarian environments, you reduce nature and biodiversity to ecosystem services. And adding to what one of the previous... Please let me finish my question. Because first, one of the previous questions mentioned that you're going from a very anthropocentric point of view. So you're only judging nature by the values it has to us. And then you go on by saying, well, if the third option of it being a disaster can either be value or moral, you you then go on by saying that there's no moral basis for it. But I would like to disagree on this, especially since this whole anthropocentric, human-centric vision of looking at the world is a very Western thing. And well, me and my ancestors have been on the receiving end of what this can mean. And even if we do not think about that, we also can look at native peoples, like the people you were mentioning near that river. They see themselves as part of natural systems. Well, you try to reduce their needs to being food or whatever they want this river for, but they see other values in it. Even in Europe, we have the Sami people who have been, by the Norwegian government, have been treated in such a way as you're describing as well. There's oil, there's minerals. Well, this is worth more than your reindeer and your beautiful landscape, so you can go somewhere else. But these people have an inherent value to this, hold an inherent vision of this land, and they hold an inherent value of the other species. They do not see themselves as the superior guiding species that is supposed to plan all of Earth's ecosystems, which would coincidentally also go far against your idea of the libertarian harsh economy, because that would essentially make it into a very thoroughly planned economy designed by us humans. Well, the previous questions have shown that we have nowhere near knowledge to be able to do that. Well, that's what's...
Okay. Now, first you should realize what I did. I did not say that I'm a proponent of using ecosystem services as an argument for the prevention of biodiversity. I just say that this is an argument being used, and what I did is a very brief studiumgene analysis of the quality of that particular argument. And it's an existing argument. To be honest, it's the argument nowadays used in the Netherlands for nature conservation. And what I tried to do is to show that there is a drawback in this particular argument. I didn't tell you what my arguments are. I just said that this particular argument have their difficulties. If you have a human-centric argument, that's the argument of ecosystem services, then this argument has particular consequences. I am not at all human-centered, except that I am a human. That as a human, I make an analysis. But for me, the suffering of animals is just as important as the suffering of humans. However, there is a bias in my thinking that you identify correctly, and that is that I strongly believe in a scientific perspective on ecosystems, and the idea of a harmonious whole that is therefore that some people have, you know. That is not in line with the modern scientific biologist view on ecosystems. And the metaphor of a harsh libertarian system is actually in line with, yeah, the current scientific status, yeah.
But even if we say it, if we go on with this harsh libertarian economy metaphor, then we ourselves are also part of the ecosystem. So where do we even get the agency to decide which other forms of the ecosystems are not suitable or not necessary?
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. If I describe ecosystem, I don't discuss Delft, you know. I discuss natural areas where we do live, but that's, you know, biologists don't study humans, biologists study plants and animals and their interactions.
But, I mean, you talked about sort of other ways of relating to nature, right? How native peoples have perhaps a different relationship with nature, and how that is important in this issue.
Well, I see it as an alternative to the vision that we should only look at nature as in what can it provide us.
Oh yeah, I agree with you completely.
Well, we've gone beyond the point that we are just part of nature, and and we are nowhere near. We don't have the knowledge or the technological capabilities to force nature into whatever we think it should be without causing major collapse. So I think we should look at other forms of assessing this.
And what other forms are you considering here? Because,
well, to admit here,
the reason I ask is because I have the feeling that you're talking about a form of human suffering that is relevant, and I think that Bas perhaps has an opinion or a view on, but I'm not sure if that's the case.
I'm not entirely sure what you mean,
okay.
But well, my view is from my specialism is urban planning, and well, their ecosystem services are more something that we use that serves us in a particular way. So we don't tend to pose that vision onto places where we value the values of nature itself. As in nature, what value does nature have without us humans? That would be the starting question to see where our place in the system should be, given that we also have needs ourselves.
Okay, I'm to be honest a little bit lost in the story, so I think it's good to move on. Who has a question?
Hi, thank you. So apart from the anthropogenic or not, like on a more meta level, I actually think you sort of also use a rhetoric trick by keep saying, well, this is like the emotional, biological argument for conservation, and I'm the rational, logical philosopher, and I'm going to make that distinction because I do ethics of technology myself, so I really am into the philosophy thing, but I also think that ethicists actually do have a responsibility on which arguments you... So I see the point that arguments should be clear, but you also said at one point, well, at this point in the debate, biodiversity loss is a disaster in itself. That has all the traction. See it, what the opposition that you get. But actually, I would say that if we look at the policies we have at this moment in the Netherlands, in the world discussion on nitrogen with the farmers, at the moment where they said, well, there's so much pressure at this moment to let go of certain definitions of nature and protection, that I think at this point in time you do have a responsibility while raising these kind of arguments, especially as it seems that it's mostly a linguistic definition kind of thing, while the title of the lecture is Why Biodiversity Loss is Not a Disaster. And you know that in these times, just the title will already be enough for many to, yeah.
Okay, if you see this as a linguistic thing, then I just failed, since I really strongly believe that the loss of biodiversity is not at all comparable in its disastrousness, whatever it be, to, for example, climate change. And it's really, and it's not a linguistic thing, it really is a thing that we should way, way, way less worry about than climate change. And it's not linguistics.
Okay, may I respond one?
Yeah.
Because, okay, so about then more content-wise, if we accept your anthropogenic starting point about suffering and what collapse is,
well,
which
it's also animal suffering, yeah?
Yeah, also animal suffering, which I personally don't accept, but if we accept that, then still you have the precautionary principle, which you also said, well, we don't know what changes the other way around, but for example, the point you made about homogenization of species over the world, I'm not a biologist myself, but I think I know that it actually makes species more susceptible for diseases, so that it would get a risk for the collapse of much larger ecosystems than just one island, but that the whole region could collapse. People are nodding. Yeah, I hope. Yeah,
it's true.
No,
it's
so
true
just like climate change, I think considering the precautionary principle, we have a moral obligation to current generations, but also future generations. Like intergenerational justice is also a really big topic to protect these species diversity.
Well, the precautionary principle comes in various forms. And the original form states that if there is a risk of something disastrousness happens, you shouldn't do anything. But that's not the form that is implemented in our daily lives, since that the formal original definition would also make it not possible to enter an airplane, since you're not sure that it won't crash. So we have a more relaxed definition nowadays that's more used. I don't know the name of that particular, it's a very well-known. Anyone knows the name of that particular, the most modern version of the precautionary principle?
Maybe Alara,
what?
As low as reasonably possible.
Yeah, so if you think there is a chance that something very bad happens, then you should better take measures. That's more or less the lay people common definition of precautionary principle. And that's very wise. The issue here is that I want to know if there are really reasons to believe that something disastrous is going to happen. And I studied this, actually I studied the biology, and to be honest, I don't see the reasons. And actually the funny thing is, if you talk to biologists, they agree, hey, come on, we all know that there won't be a collapse of an, come on. But we just like biodiversity very much, and we think it's a valuable thing. That's what we fight for.
Yet there are examples, like the fish example, of collapsing, local ecosystems.
Yeah,
so how should we unify these? How should we think about this?
No, it's possible that collapses do occur, but it's in very rare cases connected to the loss of biodiversity. It's not biodiversity loss causing the collapse, and that's also. So what happens is that people are now, for example, they trying to protect biodiversity because they think that the loss of diversity has a cause. It has a causal consequence. But very often it's not the loss of biodiversity that caused a collapse. It's a rise of temperature, or it's the fact that we removed a lot of biomass, or we did something disastrousness on our planet. And I'm not saying that we should do those things.
You do agree that there is a minimal level of biodiversity that you need for the system to be sufficiently stable, right?
I do believe that just pigs won't do, or just ferns won't do.
And you make no quantitative statements about what that level should be, simply because probably I know that science doesn't know what that level is, so we don't know. So there are some unknowns. You don't give them a lot of space, in my opinion.
Well,
is that because you want to sort of also like promote something, just like the biodiversity term is geared towards a certain goal?
It's just
you do
reasoning.
this also for this reason?
Let's do the following thought experiment. Suppose you have a checkerboard, of 10 by 10, and let's simplify the world to that. And that's 100 different ecosystems. And I've never done a thought experiment. I'm making it up now, so I might make mistakes. I don't know. And we observe those 100 ecosystems, and we see that if there are 10 different species in such an ecosystem, then actually they are okay, and 20 is better, and 30 is fine. Yeah, suppose that happens. That's your observation. Then you have 30 species in every slot, and it all works fine. Now, what would happen if we just made it one large box with, not say 30 species, but 100? You have to come with very good arguments to say that this will collapse. Whereas in this particular case, the total biodiversity loss is 97%. And still, I hope you understand.
No, I think I follow it. I mean,
If 30 species is enough on a small square of the checkerboard, then logically 30 species is also fine for the whole checkerboard. And maybe not 30, but let's make it 100.
But this could be, but we...
This is logic. This is logic.
Yeah, this is logic, but we also need to support that, or at least we need to apply that logic to a relevant system, right? And this is what scientists are trying and doing. But I would argue that there's still quite little information on what these numbers are.
On a real planet, yes, this kind of experiments you don't.
No, but you can do them on a smaller scale, but we don't have that. That's my point. We don't know.
No, on a smaller scale, you can do this experiment, and you will get the results as I predict. I think. Well, they're done by Tillman, has done this kind of experiments. Okay. But in the problem is not in the real world. That's what you, and there are hardly any experiments like this in the real world. Actually, there are some. There are people who just had cut an island in two and removed all they reduced biodiversity on the other half and looked what happened. That's an interesting
experiment too. Okay, so time for one last question. So whoever has the microphone can throw it, and then we have to wrap up, unfortunately.
Hi. So I'm not a biologist, and honestly don't know a lot of biodiversity and what are people doing with it. So and I have a couple of questions. I'm a physicist, so I actually liked your argumentation. So I have a couple of questions that I think probably will make something more clear. So first, I'm missing the context a little bit. So what people are doing and what people are thinking, and I feel like you're arguing with something, but I don't know what this something is. Like something that is going on and you think that is wrong, so what this something is the first question. And the second, so okay, assume you prove that biodiversity is not a disaster. So what do we do with it? So people do some activity to prevent biodiversity loss, right? So should we stop these activities or should we continue them but just not worry a lot about them? So
I ask what your, I start with your second question, since you have to restate your first one. I didn't completely grasp it, but actually it's a difficult thing for me to realize, okay, what should be done? I think that what I think we should do is realize the responsibility that we have as humans in designing and making the surface of the planet. We are with 10 billion people in a while. We have a huge responsibility for the surface of this planet. So let's do this wisely, and let's do it in the same way as we manage the surface of our planet in many other areas, like in cities, in all kinds of areas. We think wisely, but how do we want it to look? And the same attitude can be transposed to nature, I think. We can think about it and make decisions about how we want it to be. I think that's the kind of behavior I would support. But I do realize I did not think of what are the behavioral consequences of these thoughts. You have to restate, though, question one. I didn't get that completely.
So you mentioned several times that, okay, people do this reasoning and you consider it wrong. So you're so in your talk, you didn't really, partly you didn't do the reasoning, but just argued the reasoning of other people. Yeah. And I want you to bring me a little bit in the context, what you're arguing with.
Okay, one of the arguments that people, okay, so there is this agenda by quite some scientists in the bio world to conserve all the diversity that we have. Yeah, it's even more or less a religious obligation given to us. Yeah, if you are religious, then you feel the deep responsibility of keeping all the diversity that has been created in the past, and who are we to destroy that? So there are people who really feel the strong obligation to preserve everything that there is, and they use all kinds of arguments for that agenda. And what I do, and you see that in scientific publications, and in lots of other publications, they have this agenda, and they use arguments for that agenda. And I tend to become nervous when scientists do that, and they do their reasonings not so good, not in my opinion, but they do their, from a philosophical point of view, they don't do their reasoning so good. And then I seem to observe that there is this hidden agenda behind the scenes. And actually, lots of academic institutions now become more open about this hidden agenda, and that's also what I find good. I work at the biology department at the University of Leiden, and there they state, we are also an activistic organization trying to conserve the natural diversity. That's our goal. Clear. Then you are clear. Then you're not only describing nature, that's what a physicist does. And most physicists don't have such moral foundations, I guess. I don't know. You don't want to protect light, I think. But in biology nowadays, it used to be there, but more hidden, and now it becomes more open, which is a good thing, I think.
Okay.
Thank you.
On that note, let's wrap up. Thank you very much for taking us on this politically incorrect, taboo-breaking journey. At least that's what it's a little bit for me. Very constructive for me again. I hope it was also for you. So thank you very much.
Yep.